Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Mani, and I am NYWIFT's Special Projects Associate. This is our last screening series, and our last screening series with this weekend, and this is our last Q&A. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who joined us over the last 6 weeks. I have learned so much, and I hope you have too. I also wanted to thank my co-producers, Barbara Vasquez and Rashik Smart, without whose help this would not be possible. The screening series is part of the 2020 Creative Workshop Summit celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. And we wanted to recognize the contributions that women filmmakers made through to culture, society, and through economics. These directors seek to awaken a collective consciousness through their contribution to our world and history. This screening series was created in partnership with the International Documentary Association, IDA, which with support from the National Endowment for the Art. For this 6-week screening, we screened All In, the Fight for Documentary. We're honored to be in conversation today with the director of a film, Liz Garbus, and it was also directed by Lisa Cortes, but she won't be here with us today. And this talk will be moderated by Marsha Rock. Marsha is the Director of News and Documentary at NYU Journalism, and she's also a documentary filmmaker. Her latest documentaries are Unreigned, that is in festivals, and Service, When Women Come Marching Home, that aired on PBS station around the country. She's also co-author with Marlene Sanders of Waiting for Prime Time, the Women of Television News. Thank you, and welcome Marsha and Lisa Garbus.
Thank you so much, Ismani. I'm delighted to be here with Lisa. Lisa couldn't make it with Liz Garbus to talk about All In, the Fight for Democracy. The film weaves rich archival storytelling with the personal experiences of experts, activists, and would-be voters deprived of their rights. Now, I'm sure you all know Liz Garbus, who is a 2-time Academy Award nominee, 2-time Emmy winner, Peabody winner, Grammy nominee, and it's just great to have you here, Liz. You've been working a long time, a woman who has been on the front line of documentary filmmaking, and it's great to see your work. And you also ventured into nonfiction, fiction, yeah, which is absolutely fascinating to me that you were able to translate your directing documentary to directing a narrative film. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This film couldn't have been more timely, and I'm sure that is part of the reason it happened. So can you tell me something about the genesis of this project and your original objectives, and then maybe how they changed as you went along?
Sure. Well, thanks to New York Women in Film and Television again for having me. And I'm sorry that my partner on this project, Lisa Cortes, is under the weather. She's okay, but isn't here with us today because this was truly a team effort, as all films are. It came, well, after the 2016 election, there was a lot of talk of how did we get here? And there was a lot of talk about voter turnout, and specifically, why did folks not turn out the way they turned out for Barack Obama, or why did Democrats not turn out? And it seemed like this conversation was happening in a bit of a vacuum because 2016 was the first presidential election without the protections of the Voting Rights Act, without all of the protections of the Voting Rights Act. So it seems you couldn't really have a conversation about it without acknowledging how important the Voting Rights Act was, what it did, and then what had gone away after the Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013, which we explore in the film. So that was sort of a political awareness that I had. But the film itself was born when Stacey Abrams decided she wanted to make a documentary about the fight for the right to vote. And she came to New York and she met some different filmmakers and we had conversations. And, you know, this was a subject I'd already been thinking about. I had kind of in 2017, but I couldn't quite crack it because I'm not typically an essay filmmaker. I like to have that human beating heart in my films. And, you know, when Stacey walked in the door, there was that incredible beating heart and brains and everything else. So finally this film that I had been this kind of idea in my head had kind of crystallized. I reached out to Lisa Cortes to be my partner on this. We didn't have a luxury of time. One of the things that was very important to all of us, to Stacey, all of us, was that this film come out before the election, that people had a sense of what their rights were, what the fight had been to get us here, and some context for where we are today as a nation voting. Of course, now in the end of 2020, this election has been such a whirlwind that it's almost like everybody's become an expert, right? Like it's amazing the level of dialogue people we're having in this country about how our electoral process works and how it doesn't work. So this film is, you know, one part of that conversation.
And how did you manage Stacey's participation? Because I saw that she's an executive producer. So what were your thoughts as the producer director to manage that relationship?
Well, actually, Stacey is a producer on the film, and you know, for those of us in the business, that means she had a more kind of hands-on role. Now, she was Stacey Abrams, so she wasn't coming to the office and looking at budgets, but she was constantly consulting with Lisa and me about which voices should appear in the film, how to contextualize these issues, you know, the kinds of things that producers do. It's a different kind of role than your typical producer who's worked in the business forever, but it was really a creative and shaping role. Stacey at the beginning said that she didn't want this to be the Stacey Abrams film. She had been approached by filmmakers to follow her, very smart filmmakers, to follow her campaign before her 2018 run for governor, which would have been a great film. But she didn't want to make that film because she knew that voter suppression would be a part of it. And she didn't want that subject posited in terms of one candidate. Once it becomes about, you know, Stacey Abrams's election, you can reduce it. You can say, oh, that's Georgia, or, oh, that was because Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State, or, oh, I don't like her. You know, it becomes sort of about an individual. And this is much, much larger than that. But for Lisa and me, what we needed to do was get Stacey in it the right amount. We needed her story is so incredible, and it so echoes this journey, really our American journey, that we did need Stacey in the film, although it would not be a film without Stacey's race.
Got it. And you have so many elements in the film. You had a lot of ground to cover. How did you decide where to begin?
It was interesting. Early on, we read a piece, or it was a transcript of a panel with that Stacey was on, and Dr. Carol Anderson, who appears in our film, was on. And I think it was Carol Anderson who said, you can't understand Georgia, the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial race, until you understand the Mississippi Plan of 1890. And I was like, what? And it was like thinking about history in that narrative sense that, and what she meant was, so the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and granted the right to vote to all men, regardless of race. Of course, abolished slavery. I don't know if I said that. There's this period of Reconstruction in which Black Americans are given the right to vote, and there is great participation, and Black governors and senators are elected, and there is kind of this moment in which democracy seems somewhat inclusive. And of course, it's a terrible time of upheaval for the country, but this was something that was growing. These seeds were flowering. Mm-hmm. Of course, this caused a backlash against increased Black political power. And but what were you going to do? There was a constitutional amendment that said Black people can vote. So all kinds of laws, as Dr. Anderson says, how are you going to write a law that says, we don't want Black people to vote without actually writing a law that says we don't want Black people to vote? And the Southern states, led by Mississippi with the Mississippi Plan of 1890, figured that out. Conditions of life post-slavery, such as poverty, right? These Americans had worked for years and years and years without participating in any of their own wealth, looking for a job, loitering, that was considered a felony, a whole slate of crimes, and barriers to pass in order to access the ballot box were enacted. So literacy tests, recite the state constitution, what it says about our electoral, very, arcane things, poll taxes. People had to decide were they going to feed their family or they're going to vote. So essentially all this great moment of promise was eviscerated by the Mississippi Plan, by the Black codes, and of course by Jim Crow and white violence, right, terrorism against other Americans. And when we look at Georgia in 2018, we see a similar point on a historical timeline, in that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was this another moment of promise. You had John Lewis and Andrew Young and Amelia Boynton and so many folks walking across that Edmund Pettus Bridge to demand their right to vote. Dr. King meets with LBJ, and this really important civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, is passed. Black political participation grows once again. Barack Obama is elected president, and there is a push then again to roll back this progress. So you look at Georgia in 2018 and Mississippi in 1890, and you see, there was this great fear of Black political power, this desire to hold on to minority rule by whites, and minority rule I'll explain that later. I'm trying to compress a lot of history, but what we saw was, mass disenfranchisement once again, based upon those same circumstances. So we're able to look at history as sort of the story with these ebbs and flows and animate those arcs through our storytelling.
Very nice.
Very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. Was this more challenging than some of the other historical films that you've done?
Well, every film is challenging, and they all have their own forms of challenge. So I can't pick the most challenging child. But what we really wanted to do was make this film feel like, when I listen to Carol Anderson talk about the fight for the right to vote, when I listen to Stacey talk about it, I feel like it's a human thriller. Like you're at the edge of your seat, like the whole fight for the right to vote is like this monster movie where there's this monster who takes its head out of the water, and it's like, destroying all the voters, and then something happens and they slay the head, and then you can swim a little bit. But then a new face arises. That same monster grows this other head, and it's not safe in the water anymore. And I think we wanted the film to have that feeling of that kind of tension and excitement. So that was the great challenge and opportunity.
And how did you approach the archival research?
Well, we wanted to have archival that you hadn't felt like, we wanted to find new material. And, for some events, obviously, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, that has been seen before and is worth seeing every year or so, I would say, to understand how the bravery of these people and their incredible accomplishment and what people can accomplish when they are so fearless. But also we wanted the feeling of some kind of archival verite, feeling like, we could go interview voters now in Arizona with a group Lucha, that was out registering Latinx voters and trying to understand what the barriers were towards participation. But we wanted to feel like, you could also interview a voter in the 60s and have that feeling from them. So the challenge was to find fresh things that felt spontaneous and alive in the moment rather than anchored set pieces.
So how did you
newsreels? Yeah.
How did you go about finding those little gems? Was it local news footage? Was it other documentaries?
Well, we have an archival team. We have an archival producer and archival researcher, and Lisa and I talked about what our dreams were. We really want to have this man on the street thing, whatever our dreams were, and we give them those asks, and they work with archival clearinghouses, news stations, of course, local news, like national. There's a whole wealth of things that these folks bring to the table that is, amazing.
And did that up your budget a lot? I was always told that having archival footage makes documentaries very expensive.
I don't know. I think that, shooting is also very expensive depending on how you do it. So I think that it's not a question of upping the budget. I mean, it's a question of when you're making a film that goes through all this history, what does it cost? And, Amazon was our partner and was, supportive of us. And when we showed that, it's not a deal breaker in any sense. It's not like we're doing, space shoots with, it's like, it's fairly par for the course in our business.
How did you approach shooting the interviews?
Well, we want, our interviewees were dispersed across the country, and we wanted there to be a unified feeling for them. So we actually shot all of our interviews on a green screen, and then we shot different backgrounds all across New York City, and we composited the interviews in post. So that they could feel unified and of a sort of similar look, even though, there were Lisa and I, two different directors going out in the field, and different characters all over the country. So we unified it by using that technique.
That was pretty amazing. I was so impressed by the backgrounds that
yeah, we were not able to, yeah, and it's actually become somewhat more affordable because you can shoot the plates for your backgrounds in an hour or two. So an incredible space, like one of the spaces we shot in, the Brooklyn Historical Society, it would be a budget breaker to rent it out for a week of interviews, but can you go in for a couple of hours? Yes. That's.
I noticed that you had a table in front of everybody. Was there a reason for that?
Because there was a reason, because it was a green screen. We wanted to have a feeling of depth, of a real kind of physical space that was tangible. So that was why we put a table in front of our interviewees.
And I know a lot of our members are filmmakers, so I'm going to ask you some more technical questions because I know they really enjoyed them. You used animation. How did you develop the concept behind the animations?
Well, there were a few stories in the film that Lisa and I identified as, kind of key tentpoles to our storytelling. And some of them were stories for which no archive existed. So we decided that we would identify these 3 stories and collaborate with our really incredible illustrator, Diana Ijeta, to depict, not just the action, but the psychology inside those moments. So those moments were the story of Maceo Snipes, who is a returning World War II veteran who was assassinated after voting, the only person to vote in his county, an African-American man. The story of a young Stacey Abrams, as of the valedictorian of our high school, going to the governor's mansion where she's meant to receive a sort of a reception as a valedictorian in the state of Georgia, but being denied entry. And then also another story of Stacey and her grandmother having a conversation about her grandmother's experience of voting the first time after the Voting Rights Act was passed. So these stories were very psychological, and we wanted to collaborate with an illustrator who would help us get inside the subjects' heads during those stories.
And very effective. And the music as well, my last technical question. The music pretty much went through the entire film.
My composers would probably agree with you that they had a lot of work to do, but it's not the entire film, but there is a lot of music, yeah.
And so what was the idea behind that, to have such a strong score?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before about the feeling of tension and the thriller, kind of like edge of your seat, what's going to happen next, kind of making our history a little bit of a thrill ride. So the music really underscores that tension, the promise, the hope, the despair, similar to the way I've used it in other films and the way Lisa has used it in other films. But it was certainly a joy to work with the composers we worked with. And then we had, we have some archival songs. We have Mahalia Jackson in there. And then we have Janelle Monáe, who composed our end credit song, which was so exciting for us. But yes, music is a huge element in the storytelling style.
Right. And what did you do about outreach? With documentaries this day, outreach is such a key component for any filmmaker.
Yeah, so normally when I've worked on films, we make the film and then we say, okay, we have to put together an outreach campaign. With this film, it was like, we're starting the film and we're starting the outreach campaign at the same time. And Lisa is really the best one to talk about this because she was really all over it. But we started working with through my husband, who's the producer, Dan Cogan, raised money for a nonprofit impact campaign to go along the film. So we are doing everything from Grow Voter curriculum that goes along with the film, so it can be distributed free. I mean, reaching high school kids, people, who are, trying to get young people engaged in voting early is a key to them staying engaged in voting through their entire lives. So that was a priority for the campaign. Voter registration, of course. Film came out on September 20th, National Voter Registration Day. So we had pop-up screenings all over the country. Even during COVID, we had them outdoors in church parking lots and on football fields with pop-up screens. And, we had voter registration folks working alongside our screenings. We had ambassadors for each state, social media ambassadors for each state who would, like folks who have high level of followers posting, okay, Wisconsin, your deadline to register is tomorrow, just trying to get information out. So the impact campaign, and also for people to know their rights, if they show up to vote and they're told they're not registered, or that they've already voted, which happens a lot, or they've been subject to a purge incorrectly, what should they do in that case? I think now everybody knows the two words provisional ballots. I don't know that prior to 2020, that was on the tip of everyone's tongue. So it was about also, and it's not because of us that they all know it, but it's because of just the national conversation about voting. But having an outreach campaign which educated about your rights as a voter was key to the, in the first moments of conceptualizing the film.
And what kind of response have you gotten? Have the workers who went out with the film said anything about the power of a documentary to help their work? Encourage us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were partnered with, I should have said this when we were talking about the outreach camp, we were partnered with organizations like Black Votes Matter, Lucha, Vota Latina, Southern Poverty Law Center, ACLU, When We All Vote, tons of groups in which we gave them tools and media and messaging in order to help them spread their messages. We also, worked with them to engage voters and do voter registration and voter turnout drives. And the reaction has been great. I mean, our initial goal before we realized we'd be releasing the film during a pandemic was to have theatrical screenings with, in-person speakers, local community speakers coming to really excite people. I think that, the film provokes a sense of outrage. And then I think that the trick is, converting that outrage into action. And our hope was, when we release it, you have that speaker who's then going to harness that feeling that you have and help you, do you want to volunteer now? How many are you going to get? 5 people in your family a ride to the polls? What are you going to do? And that was key. We had to scale back that plan for our virtual world, but hopefully with our website, which, had millions and millions of hits where people could register to vote or check their registration, all of that, the film really, was able to reach a lot of potential voters.
Actually, the public was better educated to receive your film than you could have hoped for with all of that publicity.
Perhaps, yeah, there was a lot to talk about. Yeah.
I noticed that you had a section on the youth vote, which I was very glad. Was that always a primary section that you wanted to cover, or did you come across that?
Well, this was, again, sort of Stacey's role. I mean, while I'm a political junkie, Stacey, has been doing this for a long time. And, she founded the New Georgia Project 10 years ago. People know about her running for governor. They know about her Fair Fight, her organization. But as Democratic leader in the Georgia State Senate, she founded New Georgia Project, which went out, knocked on doors, and registered voters. And I think 10 years later is one of the key organizations responsible for turning Georgia blue or purple or whatever it is right now. But, engaging youth and the youth vote was always a key for her work. There's so much power in that vote. Young voters could be the most powerful voting bloc in America if they turned out. As it turns out now, it's really older folks who have that power. And you see that reflected in our representatives. Not that I'm ageist, but I think that that we could have better representation across different age groups. And so it was, so we understood that the barriers to student voting, for instance, on campuses, all of these things were really key to address.
Right. And what was it like to work with Lisa? Did you brainstorm? You were not in the same city, right?
So, no, we're in the same city.
Oh.
Yeah, we're in the same city. Lisa is in Atlanta right now, but no, we were in the same city. We worked together in Brooklyn. We were, a hive mind. Lisa, as a Black woman whose grandfather was a minister and was a voting rights activist, brought enormous, not just filmmaking experience, but personal experience. And it was very important for us to be able to have that dialogue, me as a white filmmaker, her as a Black filmmaker, to kind of be able to process, whatever blind spots I might have. And that was key. So the collaboration was really rich. And, I think if Lisa was here, she would say so too.
And what was maybe the top highlight for you before we go to all the questions I see we have coming in?
The highlight of
working on this film, like the best moment.
I think one of the best moments I had was somebody, through a crazy chain of events, forwarding me an email from a high school teacher somewhere in, I think it was Orange County, California, who had shown the film to their class and compiled a list of responses of the students in the class, talking about how they just had no idea. They just had no idea that, and one of them said something like, "Now I see that history is a fight." And just to understand what's required of us as a community to foment social change, I feel like it kind of, at least in this teacher's classroom, ignited that kind of conversation. And that was like, Lisa and I were swooning with happiness because that was exactly the type of thing that we were hoping this film would do.
Great. So I have a question. Is there a reason the film concentrated on problems which are important to identify? The problems that were solved took many years, and some by passing laws or amending the Constitution. But why not also offer solutions? Stacy only mentioned the word solution once, and solutions were only offered as an afterthought in the closing credits. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure I would totally agree with that characterization. I mean, I appreciate the question. We talked about periods in which democracy was healthier and working better. And I think you saw after the Voting Rights Act was passed, for instance, a period in which voter registration went up and in which people were engaged and involved and able to access the polls. And then we saw the Shelby County versus Holder decision and lots of other laws coming in. So I think, implicit in the narrative of the film was that the Voting Rights Act was a solution that we then discarded, and that our Supreme Court discarded. And that Voting Rights Act is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, waiting to be renewed. We also talk about tools that you can use if you were turned away at the polls, requesting a provisional ballot. So I'm not sure I agree with that characterization, because we do look at the push and pull of history. And in those moments where the franchise is granted, in those moments, we see our solutions.
I think voter suppression has many faces, and I'm sure it was a challenge to keep identifying how that face changed through time. So I understand that. Where do you think Stacy's going now? Have you spoken to her about what's going on in Georgia and her role there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Stacy is, look, they have those 2 runoffs coming up on January 5th. I think that's probably what you're referring to. Yeah. That will decide where the power lies in the Senate by party. And I think they're doing what they have been doing for years, which is focusing on voter education and turnout. Runoffs are hard. People don't mark them in their calendars or have the psychological weight of them like they have of a presidential election on a first Tuesday in November. That's kind of marked in all of our psychologies. So it's really about getting the word out, making people know there is another opportunity to participate, and how. There's still a pandemic. It's raging in Georgia. When you can request your mail-in ballot by, when you can start early voting. The answer is December 14th. And so it's all about getting that information out there. And I think, we say this in the film, but the key thing that these groups have done in Georgia, like the New Georgia Project and Black Voters Matter and Fair Fight and several other partner organizations, is knock on the doors of every eligible voter, not likely voters. That's how we kept the electorate was kept so small. But reaching out to those folks who haven't participated before, and when you run candidates like Stacey Abrams who see themselves in her, then maybe they'll turn out. I mean, that was the key for 2018, and that incredible turnout that happened in Stacey's race. She was not elected governor, but it was still kind of a beautiful thing to see all these new voters participating. They felt they had a stake. And so I think it's about that kind of engagement again.
I know that everyone I talk to says, well, Stacy's there, so that they have great hope that she'll get that, get the voters out again.
She is not sleeping. She is not sleeping much, I'll tell you that.
Were there any moments that you couldn't include in the film that you really wanted to, but it was getting too long? And can you share what those might be?
Sure. I mean, of course, there are always those moments. Stacy herself has so many amazing stories, just personal stories along her own trajectory. I love that as a sophomore in college, Stacy developed a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet for all of her goals in life, from, having a boyfriend that lasted more than 3 months to running for president by 2020. There are just stories that show the kind of focus and character and, humor that Stacy has. There are amazing heroes in the fight for voting rights. There are a lot of Black women whose stories are less known. Amelia Boynton was one of those women. Another name is escaping me, but there were other heroes that we wished we could have told the story of, but we did have, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, a lot of ground to cover. So, but we were able happily with Amazon to create extras, which you can see on the X-ray service. So when you pause it, you get to see other little bonus content. And so some of those itches were scratched through that process.
That's exciting that you had that opportunity online to add those elements. It's a great way to expand the options rather than in the intensity of real-time playing and give you a little more room to work. So that's great. Well, Liz, we don't have any other questions. So I would like to thank you so much for participating in this conversation, for making this film, for working with Lisa. And NYWIFT is so thrilled that such a great film could end this series. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I appreciate you. Thank you.